Welcome again, everyone, to this presentation by Cassandra Good on the enslaved community at Woodlawn. And we are so glad all of you joined us today for this really important program. My name is Susan Gerber-Burning, and I am the Interim Executive Director at Woodlawn Pope-Leighey House, a historic site located in Alexandria, Virginia. And we are home to two properties. The first, Woodlawn, was a former plantation that was originally part of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and its owner, Nelly Custis Lewis, was the step-granddaughter of George Washington. She and her husband, Lawrence, enslaved over 90 people between 1805 and 1839. We will be talking about this Woodlawn history today. And our second home on the site is the Pope-Leighey House, a Usonian home designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. We are also home to the Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture, a nonprofit that provides quality food to food deserts in the Washington, D.C. area. And as a historic venue, telling the full, truthful history of the site is core to our mission. And so we now focus especially on the site's indigenous history, plantation history, and stories about the lives of the enslaved, including how white owners' decisions and actions impacted enslaved lives. We also talk about the anti-slavery activism among later occupants and the history and community of free Blacks and Quakers at the site and in the region. And one way in which we strive to share these stories is through partnering with historians, descendants, and local artists on relevant programming, which is why we are all here today. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to quickly go over a few items with you. We will try to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off, but we'd like you to be aware that this session is being recorded, and if your camera or microphone happens to be on, your image and voice may be incidentally shown as part of this call and future materials. And for best viewing, I do recommend that you look now to the top right of your screen where it says speaker view. You can look at this by clicking view and then select side-by-side speaker. And that will give you the best view of the presenter, Cassandra, and her materials. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat section, and you should see that chat button at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and click that and practice that. And I see most of you have caught where that is because we're seeing where you're all from, and I so appreciate that. We will facilitate sharing your questions with Cassandra from the chat during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now, today, Cassandra will be discussing harsh realities of the enslaved people at Woodlawn. It will likely draw a variety of emotions, and at this time, we ask that you keep all questions and comments relevant, thoughtful, and courteous of the presenter and others at the presentation. And now I am honored to introduce Cassandra Good, a notable historian of American politics, gender, and culture with a special expertise on research in the enslaved people in the Woodlawn and Mount Vernon region. Cassandra is an assistant professor of history at Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. She is the author of Founding Friendships and the forthcoming First Family, George Washington Heirs and the Making of America. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, the Fred W. Smith Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon, the Maryland Historical Society, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. Cassandra, we are just so pleased to welcome you, and the time is yours until 12:45 or so when we will begin the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm so pleased to be here, and thanks to the people behind the scenes helping make this possible and everybody at the National Trust. I think the number of people here really testifies, and the fact that people are here from all over the place, to the interest in slavery in this country right now, and sort of understanding some of these stories and maybe we haven't heard before, understanding how to get to these stories. And I don't have all the answers yet. This is something I've been researching as part of a book on George Washington's step-grandchildren, the Custises. And some of you may be familiar with the Custises already. If you've been to Mount Vernon, for instance, you've learned perhaps about Nelly and George Washington Parke Custis, the two younger step-grandchildren who lived at Mount Vernon with George and Martha Washington. We often know that, before I dive into things, sort of give you a sense of where we're going here. I want to give you a little bit of background first about the kind of which historic sites we're talking about, who these people are, give you a sense of what kinds of sources we can find about enslaved people. I noticed one person in the chat mentioned they're trying to do research themselves, and so hopefully this will be helpful. I'm going to share some specific letters that tell us a bit about Nelly and her husband Lawrence's attitudes towards slavery, and finally tell you what we know about some specific enslaved people. So in terms of background, I was starting to explain the fact that many people know that George Washington freed his slaves in his will. What many people don't realize is that more than half of the slaves at Mount Vernon were not owned by George Washington. More than half of them were owned by the Custis estate, which is through Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, and she could not free them herself. Her grandchildren could have chosen to, they did not. When Martha died, they split these slaves up between the four of them. And so the enslaved people that were at Woodlawn came from several different places. So one of those locations would be Mount Vernon. The largest number would come from there. And I'll show you a list that gives us some information on that in a moment. Some of the enslaved people came from Kenmore, where Lawrence had grown up, which is in Fredericksburg. And this is the home of his mother, Betty Lewis, and her husband, Fielding. This is George Washington's sister, who he was very close with. And Lawrence is apparently the nephew that looked most like George Washington. There were also enslaved people that Nelly would have inherited when she got married. So in 1799. We don't have a list surviving of those people, but when her sister got married a few years earlier, we do have that list, and there were 60 people. So she would have inherited about 60 people probably, and those people would have come from Custis estates in Southern Virginia in New Kent County. So to give you a sense of the people coming from Mount Vernon, this is a list that shows the division of enslaved people from Mount Vernon that were owned by the Custises. We call them the dower slaves, and how they're being divided up to the different Custis siblings. Now, of course, this meant that families were divided. You had some people who were intermarried between the dower slaves and George Washington's enslaved people, which meant George Washington's enslaved people, you might have a father who was freed, and then the mother remained in slavery with her children. There were a lot of cases of that. You'd have, there were families, this top list here, Lucy and Michael and Patty were her children. One of her other children ended up at George Washington Parke Custis's estate at Arlington House. So you see, this list doesn't even give us the full extent of these family separations that happened because of this process. So that's one source we have, that list from 1802. What's also very helpful is we can match some of those people up with the most recent, before that, slave list from Mount Vernon, which was from 1799. And Jessie McLeod at Mount Vernon and I have been working on, sort of annotating that list for all four of the Custis grandchildren. There's also what was called the Divvy list at Kenmore, which was splitting up the estate of Lawrence's father, Fielding, when he died in the 1780s. There's a pretty small number of enslaved people on that list that Lawrence inherits. Nelly also had a housekeeping book, which there's a modern publication of, and she sometimes mentions, this housekeeping book is largely like recipes, and some of those recipes are for cures for things. She has things like, different medicinal treatments or foods. And she'll say sometimes, my cook Hansen did this. So we know that the enslaved person Hansen was a cook. There's also private correspondence, including a massive amount of correspondence in the Butler family papers at the Historic New Orleans collection. And I'll show you a letter from that in a little bit, and you'll see why that collection is challenging. There are estate documents that includes people's wills, as where they might specifically name enslaved people, as well as inventories of their estates that are done after they die, and that will also name enslaved people. There are census records. Those do not name specific enslaved people. It just has overall numbers until right before the Civil War. They do start at least giving age and sex, but you still don't get names. There are also tax lists. Sometimes these tax records when they were going through, you would be taxed for how many enslaved people you had over the age of 16. And sometimes those lists include the names of people. Unfortunately, the person in Fairfax County, where Woodlawn is located, did not include those names for the earlier period. I still need to look at later ones. There are also parish records from churches, church parishes, or in New Orleans, in Louisiana, things are organized by parish. And since the Lewis descendants end up in Louisiana, there's some useful records there. There are also runaway ads in newspapers. These can be tricky because sometimes they're placed by an agent for the family. And so you might not, if you're searching for the name of the family, you might not necessarily turn up with it. Knowing who they're sort of, knowing different people that worked for them can be helpful in terms of finding those. And there are several runaway ads for slaves from Woodlawn. And finally, legal cases. And I'll show you one of these cases later. So I mentioned these tax records. This is interesting because on Family Search, some of the county tax records are digitized. Just because they're digitized, not digitized, doesn't mean they don't exist. For Virginia, you might have to go to Library of Virginia to see them. And as I said here, they sometimes include names. So I discovered, like in New Kent County, in the early 1780s, we have names for Jackie Custis's estates down there. Later on, they stopped recording the names, which is a shame, obviously. And you see, like, all you're seeing here in the records, so here's Lawrence Lewis, and it's showing the number of people over 16, the number of people ages 12 to 16, and then that other number, they also number how many cattle you have and how many carriages of a few different types you have. So that's what those other numbers are. And you see this jump here between 1802 and 1803. And that jump, Martha Washington died in May of 1802. So that's where we're starting to see this jump of where Nelly's getting over 30 enslaved people from Mount Vernon. Not all of them, of course, are over 16. Some other sources that I would love to be able to find. Nobody's been able to find an inventory of Lawrence's estate when he died. This is kind of strange because it should be in the official county records, but I and others have looked and it does not appear to be there. If slave lists kept by overseers at Woodlawn exist, we have not found them yet. There are also sometimes sales records. I know that Lawrence sold people through Franklin and Armfield, which had its headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, and was the largest slave trading company in the country. There's a new book about them by Joshua Rothman that is just out. Medical records. There may be local doctors who wrote about treating enslaved people, and I'm hoping to get to look at some of the records at the Stabler-Ledbetter Apothecary, where they have a sort of cache of records that sometimes mention enslaved people. And finally, perhaps in the future, archaeology can really tell us a lot when we don't have paper records. If we can figure out where the slave quarters were at Woodlawn, doing some archaeology would help turn up material remains and give us some sense of the kind of conditions they were living in that we couldn't get otherwise. So I mentioned the letters and I mentioned the Butler family papers and that they're difficult. This is why. This is a letter written in crosshatch. Now, fortunately, the Plater family, when they donated this collection, gave money to do a finding aid. And so for every single letter, there is actually a summary of what's in the letter. So I at least had that to start from. And that is a wonderful thing to have because there's over 1,000 items in this collection. So you at least kind of know what you're looking for in these letters. But what Nelly is doing here, there were no envelopes yet. And you can see the folding lines. And so she's got a sort of 4-fold piece of paper that she's folding up, and she has to use this area as the address pane and fold this whole thing up. So if she wants to write more than 4 pages, the only way she can do it is to turn the page and write across. So this is called crosshatch. And it is extremely difficult to read, as you can see. There's no software that I know of that's been developed to make this easier, but there's incredible information in these papers. How did they end up in Louisiana? The eldest Lewis daughter, Park, She was actually Frances Park, but she went by Park. Married a man named Edward George Washington Butler, who was actually born on George Washington's birthday. And he decided to start a sugar plantation in Louisiana. So they moved to Louisiana. And in fact, Nelly spent a lot of time down there visiting, both before and after Lawrence's death. And her younger daughter, Angela, also met her husband, Charles McGill Conrad, in Louisiana. So there's also papers in Louisiana from the Conrad line. So some sources, including those Butler letters, that give us a sense of how the Lewis family themselves, you know, sort of from the white people's side of this, how did the Lewis family treat their enslaved people? What did they think about slavery? And I'm going to highlight a few letters, which frankly don't reflect very well on them. So I'm going to, this first letter is kind of shocking, but I've highlighted sort of the key part, and this is not totally out of the norm. Nelly writes a letter soon after the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. This was an attempted slave rebellion in Southampton, Virginia. And it caused people in Virginia to sort of pause and say, should we do gradual emancipation or should we crack down on slavery? And because they were doing a rewrite of the Constitution at this point in Virginia, and they decide to crack down on slavery. And you can see from Nelly's letter, the attitudes here. So she's talking about, this is, I realize, long, but our whites evince too much fear of these wretches, enslaved people. They can never succeed in subjugating the whites. She's saying the young and lovely females will be their victims. It is like a smothered volcano. This is the fear they feel of slave rebellion. We know not when or where the flame will burst forth, but we know that death in the most horrid forms threatens us. This Southampton affair, that's the rebellion. She's blaming people from Boston, specifically William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator, for inciting this. It's not our fault that we have slaves, she says. Your Southern brethren incurred this curse by no act of their own. They're trying to get rid of it. She's certainly not. Suffer them to do what they know to be best, and let not their Eastern and Northern brethren, from a false principle of philanthropy, make the blacks miserable, discontented, and rebellious, and force the whites to exterminate them. I have been assured by several gentlemen who have visited that should the blacks attempt to rise there again, they will be exterminated. The excitement is so great. I mean, obviously this word exterminate is quite disturbing. She was not the only one to use it. There is a language around extermination that K. Wright Lewis at Howard University has written about, but I have not seen, I mean, this is certainly not the wording we would see from George Washington. This is not to say he was an anti-slavery hero by any rate, but she's moving into a sort of pro-slavery, anti-Black stance that goes, sort of goes along with some of the changing views happening in Virginia and in the South at this time in America. This is the 1830s. Here we have a visitor to Woodlawn, giving us a sense of what it's like to be there and see enslaved people. And this is somebody, Thomas Hubbard, I forget where in the North he was from. So he's talking about the enslaved people at Woodlawn being like children. It is the policy of the whites to treat them with kindness, and they believe they are generally as happy, if not more so, than their superiors. He was visiting at Christmas time and is saying that they were decorating over the country with packs on their backs, going to visit their friends and relations, fixing guns, turning coppers, and playing marbles. They appear to be far from vicious and are always subservient and submissive to the whites. So we get the sense he's visiting Woodlawn. He is observing people that he thinks are well taken care of. Now, you know, I was talking to my students earlier this morning about the fact people sometimes ask, is there such thing as a good master? And my answer to that is no. Anybody who owns people, that's bad. It does not matter how well you clothe or feed people that you own them. And this gives us a sense that perhaps the enslaved people at Woodlawn were, you know, not being underfed or wearing tattered clothes like at some estates, and that they are subservient and submissive. Not necessarily because that is their state of being and how they would like to be, but out of fear and necessity. So we get some sense from a document like this of the conditions of enslaved people at the estate. Here's an interesting letter from Park's husband, Edward George Washington Butler. And he's writing this in 1853. And he's telling a story, which I think is not true, that is some kind of perversion, that George Washington had talked to Lawrence Lewis about the plan to free his slaves and asked Lawrence's opinion, and that Mr. Lewis expressed the opinion that they, the slaves, were far happier in a state of slavery. And that George Washington basically was just freeing his slaves because he felt like that's what some people in the country wanted. I mean, that's not true. He had a conviction behind this. And what Butler is telling us is the descendants of the latter, the people who were kept in slavery, have been and are prosperous, contented, and happy, while the former, after a life of vice and dissipation and idleness, may literally be said to have disappeared from the face of the earth. Again, this is not true. We see records of, there are scant records, but they exist, of people who were freed by George Washington who were still living in the area. And because they had to register as free Blacks, they did not disappear from the face of the earth. Totally untrue. And obviously this is some sort of placating himself and trying to justify slavery and saying that the people who were enslaved are better off than those who were freed. This is somebody who lives in Louisiana, whose children are going to fight for the Confederacy and the Civil War, and who has convinced himself that slavery is better than freedom. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the enslaved people that I've been able to find some information on. It's pretty hard to find information on specific people, partially because there are a lot of names that get repeated. And while enslaved people did have last names, enslavers almost never recorded them, which is very frustrating. This person, Dolce, we actually know a little bit about. She had been a dower slave owned by the Custuses at Mount Vernon, and she did spinning and washing, and was a house servant in the mansion house. And she was married to a man named Joe, who was a carpenter owned by Washington and freed in Washington's will. She was given to the Lewises in the 1802 division after Martha's death, along with her children, Suki and Dennis. So we're not sure what happened to her husband. Where was he living? Were they able to still live together? Her niece, Lucinda, it's unclear exactly who Lucinda's mother was later given to Park as a wedding gift. Went with Park first when she and her husband moved to Ohio, and then later to Louisiana, and she was called by their children Mammy. Interestingly, the other mention that we have of Dolce is in 1835, Lawrence tried to sell a child that Dolce cared for. It's unclear who this child was, whether it was a grandchild of hers or some kind of great niece. And ultimately, this friend did not sell her, as I thought the old woman might think herself in greater trouble than she could bear. 1835 is when Lawrence is selling a bunch of his enslaved people. Woodlawn is no longer profitable. He ends up selling a large number of people to Louisiana. There's another description that comes of Dolce that comes from Edward George Washington Butler, from 1853 also. And he tells the story that Dolce, he says, the morning after my engagement to Park, Dolce, the faithful and ladylike old servant of Mrs. Lewis, came to my room and after an old-fashioned curtsy said, "Pardon me, Major, for obtruding on you. I merely came to congratulate you on becoming a member of our family." Now, this is kind of hard to wrap our head around. Why is Dolce saying this? Why is she saying you're becoming a member of our family? It was common in the antebellum era for white enslavers to refer to slaves as part of their family, but you don't sell members of your family, right? This is a cover to sort of make slavery more palatable. Why Dolce would say this is an interesting question, and I think takes some interpretation and guesswork to think about, what she's thinking and doing here. Lucinda, we also know a little bit about. Butler refers to her as somebody who would be a remarkable woman among those of any color. She has charge of everything connected with my household. And he says, when a girl, having received proposals of marriage from a wealthy quadroon of New Orleans, a mixed race person, who offered to purchase her freedom and settle upon her an annuity of $300, she replied, I would not leave Frances, Miss Frances, her mistress, to marry any man in the world. Again, kind of hard to understand this story. I mean, we know in that other letter where Butler's talking about George Washington freeing his slaves and what happens to those people that he has a lot of facts mixed up. This would have been at least in his own personal experience. Did Lucinda actually get a proposal of marriage? What was her calculation in deciding that she would rather remain enslaved? Is that actually what happened? Was she pressured? We really don't know. We have to make educated guesses there. But at any rate, Lucinda does stay with the Butler family. Another family is the Leighs, and I mentioned them before, that Lucy and her children, Michael and Patty, went to or sent to Mount Vernon after Martha's death. Lucy was married to Frank Lee, who was owned by George Washington, and the brother of William or Billy Lee. This is, if anybody has heard a name of any enslaved person from Mount Vernon, it's likely William Lee, because this was the enslaved person who accompanied George Washington during the American Revolution. And he is the only person that George Washington freed outright in his will in 1799. The terms of his will were that his people would not be freed until Martha died. William Lee was the only one who would be freed immediately. And he stayed living on the estate. He had bad knees. He was actually injured, like even during the presidency, he could no longer serve George Washington in the House because of his bad legs. And there were people that saw and talked to William Lee in the early 19th century at Mount Vernon. So his sister-in-law, Lucy, and her younger children, Michael and Patty, end up at Woodlawn. Her older son, Philip, who was then a teenager, was sent to Arlington House with Nelly's brother, George Washington Parke Custis, where he later became a butler of a sort. And he apparently looked enough like his uncle William Lee that when Lafayette came to visit in 1824 and 25 and met him, he recognized him and said, you know, you look like your uncle. And actually, Wash Custis was proud of this story and shared it. But again, we see this family is getting separated in order to just serve, you know, what the white Custises decide they want in terms of which people in which jobs they want at their homes. Some other people that we know come from Mount Vernon. There's a woman named Eve, who was the daughter of the chef Hercules, who you may have heard of before. There's a man named Peter, who was a distiller. And I use this term self-emancipated. That is our sort of new way of saying escaped, took his own freedom in 1803. We know this from a Runaway Ad. There's David or Davy Gray, who had been an overseer at Muddy Hole Farm. And finally, Hanson, this person that was a cook that I mentioned that comes up in Nelly's Housekeeping Book. Because he is a distiller also, and probably because of his age, his level of strength and knowledge, was the highest valued person that Nelly inherited in 1802. Now, this story of Peter Twine is a tough one. I mentioned court cases, and this court case has actually been digitized. You can read the whole thing through the Virginia Memory website. It's unclear exactly how Peter Twine is related to the Twine family that we usually associate with Tudor Place, where Sal Twine and her 4 children went, and where one of her children would father mixed race children with one of the Peter family sons. And there's a whole other big story involved with the Twines over at Tudor Place. George Twine, the gardener, was emancipated, so it is unclear who this Peter Twine is. In 1805, he was charged with the rape of a white woman. He pleaded not guilty, However, he was found guilty and he was hung at the county courthouse. Because his property had been taken from him, Lewis was compensated with over $300, which is a good amount of money at this point. And you can see here, it is the unanimous opinion of the said court that the said Negro Peter Twine is guilty of the offense, whereupon it is ordered that he be conducted back to the jail of this county and from thence to the place of execution, where he is to be hanged by the neck until he is dead, dead, dead. Apparently this dead, dead, dead phrase, this is not trying to be melodramatic. This is a phrase that was used in these contexts. This is another story where, we have the story of the white woman who he purportedly raped. We certainly know that in the later 19th century, there was sort of a panic over the idea that Black men and white women would have sexual relations. Was this a consensual relationship that, she charged was a rape because interracial sex was illegal? Was this actually a sexual assault? We don't know. But we do know that Twine was executed for this. Another person we know a little bit about, Samuel. He was a carriage driver, and he'd be the one to go get the mail for the family. They did not get mail delivered to their door. Woodlawn was actually kind of in the boonies at this point. It was far from things. Samuel was specifically given to Nelly and Lawrence's will, and he is the only person that Nelly emancipates in her will. She refers to him as my faithful Sam. And if there's money left over, give it to him as a remembrance from his old mistress whom he has served so faithfully. So again, the only person that the Lewises free that I have located. Now the other Custis siblings, two of the other siblings do free some of their enslaved people, and George Washington Parke Custis frees all of his enslaved people in his will, but Nelly and Lawrence don't seem to have any desire to do that. And I think you could see from the language in those letters, in fact, they are people who are not just okay with slavery, they are pro-slavery. Okay, what now? Obviously, there's more research to do. I mentioned a few different things that I'm hoping to find. And, maybe somebody out there has other documents. Maybe there's documents owned by the family or in obscure archives or in state archives that we haven't located yet. Maybe there's archaeology that can be done. And I know that certainly the next step for Woodlawn and the National Trust is they want to include these stories in the interpretive experience at Woodlawn so that everybody who visits can hear about these important stories and not just hear the story of the white Lewises. Also, in terms of locating descendants, I know that there are descendant community events through Woodlawn. Sometimes there are oral histories in families that can give us information that we couldn't get otherwise. And that can be a useful source. Also, just having people, the descendants who are stakeholders who, may not just have other information, but have important emotional connection to these stories, having them as part of the process, I think is really important. So I've finished up fairly quickly here because I know there will be a lot of questions. Susan, I'm coming in like 10 minutes before time, but I'll just put up a final slide for anybody who wants to keep up with my work, which is not solely on slavery. I work a lot on gender and politics as well. This is my Twitter handle, website, and you can also feel free to email me at my Marymount email address.
Thank you, Cassandra, for your work in getting to the heart of enslavement at Woodlawn and finding and sharing real stories and names and giving voice to the enslaved that show what the truth is, or at least, as we uncover it. And thank you also for presenting the gravity of the Woodlawn history and the understanding that really some of the worst things that we have heard about regarding the lives of the enslaved generally have taken place right here at Woodlawn. And this group has posted so many questions to talk about, so let's get started with Q&A. But just to kick it off, as you had mentioned in previous conversations, that Lawrence in particular had a terrible approach and reputation, in the area toward about his approach toward slavery and the enslaved. Would you elaborate on Lawrence just a bit?
So yeah, Lawrence is an interesting figure. We don't know a ton about him. Most of his letters that survive are business letters. He was one of the executors of Washington's estate. But, the little tidbits I've picked up about him, so he doesn't come off great beyond the slavery issue. As soon as he married Nelly, and they were on their honeymoon, he was ill and had eye problems and had to be in a dark room for a month. And he ended up being an invalid for most of his life after that. He was cited multiple times for failing to vote in local elections, which at this point was mandatory, and you could be brought into court for failing to vote. So this is not somebody who has inherited his uncle's civic mindedness. He sells multiple enslaved people to Louisiana. He sells people through the slave dealers, Franklin and Armfield. He separates families to do that. That's in many ways the ugliest part of slavery, right? And just to imagine people being sold to Louisiana from Virginia, beyond the fact that in some cases they'd be forced to walk there. In other cases, they're being taken on a ship. Most of them were not allowed to learn how to read and write, so they can't even communicate with their relatives. You occasionally see notes going back and forth in the Butler's letters that say hello, or so-and-so says, say hello to so-and-so. That would be the lucky enslaved house servant who even had access to do that kind of thing. Most of these people were never going to be able to talk to their families again, and that's just devastating.
Thank you. Thanks for elaborating. And I know everyone on this call has an interest in the connection with Louisiana. That's some big work that's being done nationally. So thanks for bringing that piece up too. So let me jump into some of these other questions. We do have a lot. Regarding the October letter from Nelly to Harrison Gray Otis, why was she writing to him in the first place? What was her role there?
So she was friends with Harrison Gray Otis. She had known him for a while, and he was mayor of Boston. And I think the real purpose of her letter, at the beginning of it, she says, you guys should hang William Lloyd Garrison, who lived in Boston and had started the Liberator. So she's trying to say, you need to stop these abolitionists in Boston from what they're doing. So that's sort of her main purpose. And, interestingly, her sister-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis's wife, Mary, writes a letter after this too, where she has a totally different response. She would have liked her husband to free all of their enslaved people much sooner, not wait until his death. And so she is basically saying, I understand why this happened. So we get two very different perspectives. Did you want me to stop the screen share at this point?
Actually, yes, that would be good. And that kind of pushes the question that a lot of us have had, which is George Washington and his views, and then this person that was so dear to him, Nelly, and what went wrong there, what happened, and Washington's, not a fully pure figure either, but what went wrong with Nelly? Was it an influence of who, or was this Nelly's intrinsic belief, these beliefs that are showing up?
Yeah, I mean, George Washington's really complicated because, of course, right, he does free people in his will, and he should get credit for that. He is, he did think about trying to free people during his lifetime. I would argue that he could have done it. He didn't. And part of why he's freeing people is not just humanitarian reasons, it's economic reasons. They're no longer, he has more people than he needs at Mount Vernon. And also there's no descendant that's going to be hurt by this. He knows that the grandchildren are going to get all of these Custis slaves. His nephew, Bushrod, who's going to inherit Mount Vernon, has his own enslaved people. So I don't see it as an entirely humanitarian act. On the other hand, people in the late 18th century who lived through the Revolution did feel differently about slavery than the next generation would. They felt like many of them, like people in Virginia in particular, would say, we don't like this. We need to end it eventually, but they weren't willing to actually make the sacrifices to do it. They sort of were like, well, the next generation will figure it out. But they knew it was wrong. Whereas as cotton becomes increasingly profitable in the antebellum period, especially with takeoff of the cotton gin and the opening up of some of the Western lands after the War of 1812, and people are making just insane wealth off of slavery. Now they're at the point where they're no longer having doubts about slavery. It's, we need to figure out how to tell anybody who thinks this is wrong that this is actually really good. And there's a whole pro-slavery language. And racism actually gets worse rather than better. So it's not a straight line of progress.
Great, very powerful information. That's helpful. And we've got about 15 questions more. At what point did Virginia law require men muted enslaved persons to leave the state?
So that law is from 1806. So certainly, and from what we can tell, it's pretty rare that the state actually enforced that. There were other provisions that went in 1806 that also made it harder to free people, but it was possible. And, you know, George Washington Parke Custis frees a number of women and children. How many of them were his is still, you know, we suspect a number of them were his children. He was technically in the District of Columbia in Arlington, so different laws applied to him than they would to Nelly and to the Lewises. But it certainly was possible, although more difficult. They also required that you ensured the financial stability of people you freed, which George Washington did. And the Lewises didn't really have the money to do that. That doesn't mean it was impossible for them to free their enslaved people. If they had sold land, they certainly could have.
What does that mean, ensure the financial stability?
So the concern from the government, the state government, is we don't want to have to take care of freed slaves. And so what they're saying is if somebody is old, you have to give them like an annuity. We know there's records of the executors of Washington's estate giving clothes, like yearly clothes allotments to freed slaves. Clothes were actually pretty expensive back then. So that was, you know, so providing for them in these ways. These are people who have not been allowed to read or write or learn a skilled trade. And so it's not going to be easy for them financially to take care of themselves. And so the state doesn't want them ending up as paupers, people who can't care for themselves, where then the government would have to step in. So they want the enslavers to do that themselves.
Okay, thank you. Pat Donahue asks, my research indicates that only 2% of slaves found freedom through last wills and testament. Is this for New Jersey only or nationwide? I guess Pat is in New Jersey.
I don't know about the total percentage. And I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, New Jersey, I think that number would be the case in part because gradual emancipation laws are happening. Like for states that have gradual emancipation laws, states north of the Mason-Dixon line, or even states like Massachusetts or Vermont that end slavery outright, you don't necessarily need to have people at that point freeing their slaves in their wills because they're freed. It's really a pretty short window during which people are doing this. And it's largely in Virginia between the Revolution and like the early 1790s. And it is almost all, and I've sort of been looking for examples that would disprove this. From what I've seen, people who either don't have children or like the example of Carter, who frees his slaves. He has so much money that it is not going to hurt his children financially to free his slaves. I don't see people who realize it's going to affect their children financially that free their slaves. The Quakers, that's the exception. The Quakers do it.
Right.
Earlier.
Right. Goodness. Okay, so do we have any idea what the experience would have been like for the freed people from George Washington's will in the same communities?
I'm actually looking to see on the chat here if there is another historian who is starting research on this. It doesn't look like he made it here, but it's pretty hard to tell because we know they had last names, but their last names were not recorded. we've been able, there's an article by Edna Medford that does track down some of them. We know that some of them end up in what is now the Gum Springs community. So we know that a bunch of them stay in the area. Some of them may still have lived at Mount Vernon. And you might think like, well, why wouldn't they just leave? Well, they're intermarried with other people in the community and with Custis enslaved. So we can see why they would stay in the area. They have roots there. It's possible some of them leave and go to other places and they just disappear from the record because we don't have their last names. I mean, the main record we have of them is people who have stayed in the area and registered because free Blacks were required in DC and Virginia to register as free Blacks and prove that they were free. So that's the main source of the people that we still know, but there's a lot I think we could still learn. I'm sure things, we see Lawrence's account or Butler's account that they disappear. They don't disappear, but I'm sure things were not easy for them.
Right. Okay, so these questions are spanning a lot of time here, but you're doing really well, Cassandra. Thank you. Why didn't George Washington free the enslaved while he was alive? What was the calculation there?
So I was just looking, and actually yesterday talking to Jesse McLeod, who I know is on the call, who did the amazing exhibit on slavery at Mount Vernon. And and I think Mary Thompson, who wrote a book on this, also has her own take. Like, it's not entirely clear. Part of his concern is clearly that they're intermarried with the dower slaves. And what is that going to mean if you free half the people on your estate and they're married and have kids with the other half? It seems like he's just putting that off because if he frees them in his will, that's going to be a problem eventually. It's just a question of when. Financially, he is looking at trying to sell some land. He seems to think he needs more money to afford it. He's trying in 1796 to do that actually, but nothing happens with it. He wasn't trying to sell the most valuable land he had. So I don't know how hard he was really trying. We can also sort of contrast this with the fact that at the same time that he's thinking about possibly freeing these people, if anybody's read the book Never Caught by Erica Armstrong Dunbar, he's chasing down an enslaved woman who escaped or self-emancipated from the president's house in Philadelphia. When his enslaved cook Hercules escapes, he also tries to track him down. And he's basically trying to trick Ona Judge to come back into slavery. So, we can't just say, well, he was clearly anti-slavery all around. It's really complicated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, it must go down you must be pulling a lot of strings and threads and finding so many stories, which again points directly to the vital need for this work and important to really focus on it at this time. And to whom did Lawrence sell the majority of the slaves in 1835? We're swinging you through time again.
Yeah, and I've got the name recorded. I didn't put the name into the presentation. It was a Louisiana planter. And I know that David Plater, who wrote, this book is great, The Butlers. So this is about Park and Edward George Washington Butler, and he tracked down a lot of the enslaved people. That's another part of my research. I need to look at that list that David Plater has to see exactly which people he sold and whether any of them match up at that point with the 1802 list we have. They may not, because it could have been people that Lawrence inherited from Kenmore, or it could be Custis people from the New Kent farms. The Custis owned so many enslaved people. It is hundreds. It's hard to sort of wrap your head around how many people are involved here.
Mm-hmm. And I know we've talked about National Trust for Historic Preservation Property down there, the shadows and the sugar plantation and the relationship to what you're talking about here, and the sugar plantation, the Weeks papers. And so I know that's more exploring that you're going to be doing, and we'll look forward to hearing over this next year and a half as you're doing more research and more writing for your upcoming book. Around the question of the Butlers, are the Butlers related to Pierce Butler, who had the big auction of the Butler slaves near Savannah? That's a question that came through the chat.
I have not looked to, I suspect that they're distantly related, but I am not sure how. I mean, a lot of these people in the South were related to one another. That's an interesting question. They weren't closely related. Edward George Washington Butler's father had fought in the Revolution, and he was orphaned when he was fairly young. And in fact, he was unofficially sort of taken in by Andrew Jackson, another person who we can certainly associate with pretty terrible things when it comes to slavery, and even worse with Native people. So that maybe that tie to Andrew Jackson tells us more about any tie to the the larger Butler family.
Thank you. Possibly related here, did the Haitian slave revolt increase the fear or hatred of slave holders?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, seeing what happened in Haiti really freaked people out. And then, you know, there's Gabriel's rebellion that comes in the midst of this in 1800 in Virginia when James Monroe was governor, and there was a plot to kidnap him that, you know, was thwarted. So people in Virginia, like Nelly, certainly would have heard about this growing up. The Federalists, including like John Adams, wanted to recognize Haiti, and Nelly was a Federalist. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, when Jefferson came in, he was like, no, we're not recognizing Haiti. This is a terrible example. She might well have met whites who had fled from the Haitian Revolution, because a lot of them went to Philadelphia and to New Orleans. So it is entirely possible that she met these people and heard stories from them.
Another question, and this goes back to Martha. Is this true? Didn't Martha basically chase down a runaway slave of hers, her personal slave? This participant says that they understand that she was very harsh toward her slaves, and her letter seems to support that. This person is wondering, did she own slaves separately from George Washington, which I think you've already touched on, but.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned when you asked about, like, how does Nelly end up saying something like she did, like exterminate? Martha Washington does not have any kind of awakening towards anti-slavery that George Washington has. And we know, you know, again, as this person is saying from her letters, that the way she talks about enslaved people, Nelly probably picked up a lot of that. And I think in terms of the chasing down of Ona Judge that this person is referring to, it's both Martha and George who are doing it. Ona Judge was a dower slave, so she would have been owned by the Custis estate. Martha had, as a widow, a right to the use of 2/3 of the slaves. So she actually brought, and we have a list of the enslaved people that she brought with her to Mount Vernon. And most of the house servants, enslaved people at Mount Vernon, were hers. So in fact, most of them end up, like, you may have heard of Carolyn Branham, who's in the room when Washington dies, Christopher Shields, who's a butler there. They end up at Arlington House with George Washington Parke Custis. So a lot of these people are dower slaves, but Martha is sort of holding them in trust. She doesn't, I'm trying to think, I think she might have one or two people. Jesse, who's on the call, probably knows the answer and maybe can type this in for me. She may own a couple people in her own right, but the vast majority of people are owned by the Custis estate.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to wrap up the questions, but let me just close with this one. Know that to those of you on the call, please keep putting your questions in the chat for the next couple of minutes. And what we will do is consolidate the questions and answers from this session. We've got this recorded, and we'll write this in text so that you can also have that, but also we'll put this video up online in the next couple of weeks. So watch for this in the next 2 to 3 weeks, more information as we kind of consolidate what Cassandra's talked about. But Cassandra, your work researching and writing your book will continue all through the next year. For you personally, what are your most pressing questions about the histories of the enslaved at Woodlawn in the region now, after doing some of this research?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. You know, this isn't necessarily about Woodlawn, but the main thing I really want to understand is the degree of family connection between the white Custises and the enslaved people. There's a man named William Costin who may or may not have been fathered by Jackie Custis, Martha's son. So that would have been a fifth Custis sibling. And nobody has really been able to nail down whether he was related to them or not, but that's a pretty big deal. And, that's again, coming out of clearly a sexually exploitative relationship. We don't know exactly. There's some stories about who his mother was, but even that's unclear, but he was mixed race. And then we know that there were enslaved people fathered by George Washington Parke Custis through sexually exploitative relationships and through some of the Peter sons. And so I think, since I'm writing a book about the family, who counts as the family? And, certainly the white Custises didn't acknowledge them as family, although, Wash did more towards that than others. I don't like giving Wash very much credit, but I think just sort of being able to piece together, I want to have as much evidence as possible before I make a claim. And it's possible that there were people that Lawrence fathered. I haven't found any evidence of that. Wouldn't surprise me. Or his son Lorenzo, entirely possible.
Thank you. So what we'll do with people who have follow-up questions or that want to connect with you, we'll go ahead, Trinity, if you would put the Woodlawn website and the email, go ahead and send all of anyone who wants to connect with Cassandra, send that to us, and then we'll forward those all on to her. And Cassandra, with all our hearts, thank you. The terrible vein of slavery runs so deep, and we know that there can no longer be any sacred figures. There never should have been. And so we want to work hard with you in these coming years. And we really appreciate it. Without you, I think some of this information is harder to have come to light. For the participants on the call, we do welcome your feedback and your questions about today's program. We'll collect all of these questions, as I said. Please watch also on our website for monthly African American historical programming and other educational programs and events on the calendar. We have a full slate of programs in May, such as historian Isabella Rosner, Stitching History, and Miasia Osby's Occupying White Spaces. This summer as well, we'll be adding Indigenous history programs, and in the fall, we begin a series of convenings around BIPOC histories. So please do follow us, sign up for our newsletter updates if you're not already, and please feel free to reach out to me or anyone at Woodlawn, and we'll connect you with Cassandra going forward. Thank you all, and we hope you have a good rest of day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.